In order to install and run virtual hosts on a physical computer which is running VMware ESXi 5.0, as I mentioned in another video, you have to allow the actual feature first. You have to add this extra line into the configuration of VMware to support virtualized hardware virtualization. Once you've done that, you can then start creating virtual machines which can run bare metal hypervisors like ESXi or Hyper-V. Now for this demo I'm only covering virtual hosts that run ESXi because there are different configuration requirements for these. But once you've enabled the actual feature on the physical computer, you would then create a virtual machine. So I'll go with custom here, give this a name of test, point it to the storage drive, just stick with hardware version 8. For the operating system I'll select other and then other 64-bit, although I will actually be changing this once the virtual machine's been created. I need at least 2 CPUs to run ESXi and 2 GB of memory. I'll connect the network card to the trunk port group. Because this is a demo, I'll only use one, although I could add up to 4 here, or even add additional network cards afterwards. For the adapter type, I prefer to stick with E1000. As I've said, I'm going to be changing the guest operating system, and once I've done that, only the E1000 and E1000E network cards will be available for any future network card that gets added to this virtual host. So I'd rather keep things consistent. Having said that, I have actually created a physical computer that runs ESXi 5.1, and I was using VMXnet 2 or 3 for the virtual hosts. And what I was finding is that when I installed ESXi 4.1 into the virtual host, it might crash with a trace error partway through the installation. And when I tried it with ESXi 5.0 on the virtual host, it would generate an error and it would halt the installation, saying that it couldn't find the network card. Now, interestingly enough, after I'd rebooted the actual physical computer and tried that again, I was finding that I could actually create these virtual hosts and still use these VMXnet adapters. So it's quite possible I just was running into a bug at the time. But either way, as I've said, because I'm going to be changing the guest operating system and I'm going to be limited to one of these 2, I'd rather just keep things simple and avoid any potential future bugs, to be honest. For the disk provisioning, since this is just a lab, I'll just stick with thin provisioning. And then before I create the virtual machine, I'll just make some last minute changes. So I'll delete the floppy disk drive, point the CD drive over to the ISO file that I'll be creating this from. So in this case it's ESXi 5.0, and then I'll click on the connected power on. Now go over to the options tab and click on this drop down menu. There's no additional operating systems have appeared to actually choose. They don't appear until you actually create the actual virtual machine itself. So I'll just click on finish and that creates the virtual machine. So what you would do next is you would change the actual guest operating system. So if I go over to options, then over to the menu here, there's 2 additional operating systems have appeared, one for VMware ESXi 5.x and one for VMware ESX 4.x. Now, if I install version 5 is the hypervisor into this virtual host, I found that you can actually leave it set to other 64-bit. On the other hand, if you're going to use ESXi 4 on your virtual host, you do have to select this VMware ESX 4.x as the operating system, otherwise you'll run into errors when you actually try to make use of that host. So for the sake of consistency, what I'll do here is I'm going to set the the actual guest operating system to 5.x, even though it would work if I left it as other 64-bit, because I like to keep things consistent. Now, once I've made that change to the operating system, I go back into the settings again and click on Add. You'll notice that when I come to add a new network card, as I said before, I've only got a choice of either E1000 or E1000E. So as far as I can see, it's easy just to stick with E1000 for these virtual hosts. Once you've done that, that's all you need to do. I mean, I'd be able to power this up, install ESXi 5.0 into this virtual machine, and then I'll start to be able to nest virtual machines on it and take advantage of the features like vMotion and so on using vCenter. So just to demonstrate some of the problems that I've run into, I mean, I've got two hosts here, host 1 and host 2. They're both configured as they've had VMware ESXi 4.1 installed, and the operating system has been set to ESX 4.x. Host number 3, on the other hand, although it has ESXi 4.1 installed, I've deliberately left the operating system set as other 64-bit. Now, it didn't complain at all during the installation process, but as I'll show in a minute, it does actually generate errors when I try to use it. This server, on the other hand, I've installed ESXi 5.0 onto it, and as you can see, I've set the guest OS to VMware ESXi 5.x. So if I go over to vCenter, I've got host 1, host 2, host 3 and host 4 up and running. I've already built some servers on host 1 and 2 that are up and running. If I select this server 1, for instance, and try to migrate it, if I select host 2, I'll get validation succeeded. If I go to host 4, I get validation succeeded. Whereas if I go to host 3, it actually generates an error message. So host 1 and host 2, if you recall, have been configured with the operating system of VMware ESXi 4.x, whereas host 3 is being left with other 64-bit. And what I'm getting is this error message saying that basically the hardware virtualization isn't working. The next button here is grayed out, so I can't really do anything more with this host other than going back and then fixing that operating system. But just to demonstrate, I mean, I can certainly just migrate a server across from a version 4 to a version 5 host. Another thing that I've done is I've created a virtual machine on this host 3, and it's gone in, it's created the virtual machine itself for Windows Server 2008 R2. But if I try to actually power this server on, it goes straight and starts to give me an error message here about the virtualization not working. If I go back to the physical server again, what I did after setting up those servers was I took this command out of the configuration file in order to demonstrate what happens if you don't actually enable the feature. So I created another server, another virtual host, which is host 5 here. I've changed the guest operating system over to ESXi 5.x, but when I powered it up, it got so far through the installation process and then generated this error message. So that's the sort of error message I would get if, for instance, the processor didn't support extended paging tables, for instance, on an Intel processor. But in this particular case, it's generating that error message because simply the actual physical computer itself didn't have this feature enabled. It wasn't allowing virtualized hardware virtualization when this particular virtual host was actually created. For this virtual host, I built this straight after this one. So again, this this particular configuration parameter is missing from this physical server. I've installed 4.1, ESXi 4.1 on it, and I've set the operating system to VMware ESX 4.x, but it didn't have any problems with the installation at all. But when I go over to vCenter, if I try to migrate this particular server from host number 4 here, if I try to then migrate this over to host number 6, I'll get this same error message about how virtualization, the hardware virtualization, isn't working. Interestingly enough, even though I've taken that command out of the physical server config, I can actually still migrate this server back over to this server here, for instance. So even though the command's missing, these 3 servers, host 1, 2 and 4, are all working perfectly fine. Obviously, if I don't put this command back into the configuration file of that physical server, when I come to boot the physical server back up, I know I'll run into these similar sort of problems if I try to run any of these version 4 servers or this version 5 server. So obviously you do need that command to get these all to work. So as far as running ESXi virtual hosts on a physical computer which is running ESXi 5.0, you have to allow the feature on the physical server itself. So you've got to modify its configuration file by adding that parameter in. You then create your virtual machine with the other 64-bit operating system. Then once that virtual machine is created, you would then go back into its settings and you change the guest operating system over to either ESXi 4.x if you're going to be running a 4.x operating system in your virtual host, or you would change it to 5.x if you're going to run VMware ESXi 5.x as a virtual host within that virtual machine.